Let me share something that might challenge everything you've been taught about kindness and human nature. For decades, we've been told that being nice, forgiving, and compassionate is always the right path. And truthfully, among decent, respectful people, that's absolutely correct. But when you're dealing with someone who has narcissistic traits, your kindness isn't received as a gift. Instead, it's interpreted as a signal that you're willing to submit. And once they sense that vulnerability, everything changes. If you've ever felt confused about why your patience and understanding seem to make someone treat you worse rather than better, you're not alone. Today, we're going to explore the uncomfortable truth about how narcissists view relationships and why your natural instincts to be kind and empathetic can actually become the very weapons used against you. This isn't about becoming cold or cruel. It's about understanding the difference between healthy compassion and self-destructive enabling. By the end of this discussion, you'll have a clearer picture of when kindness serves you and when it betrays you. So please, like this video if you find it helpful, and let's dive into something that could fundamentally change how you approach difficult relationships. The hierarchy game, understanding the narcissist's framework. Here's what most people don't realize about narcissistic individuals. They don't view relationships as partnerships or collaborations. To them, every interaction is part of a hierarchy, a dominance game where someone wins and someone loses. They're not seeking genuine intimacy or connection. They're seeking leverage and control. When you offer kindness, understanding, or forgiveness to a narcissist, they don't think, "What a wonderful, generous person." Instead, their internal reaction is more like, "Good, I've got them trained. They'll accept whatever I give them." This isn't me being cynical. This is a documented psychological reality. Narcissism, at its core, is what psychologists call a compensatory pathology. It's essentially a fragile ego masked by a grandiose persona, one that requires constant external validation to survive. Your kindness becomes high-quality fuel for the system. They feed off your accommodating nature, your willingness to give the benefit of the doubt, your desire to see the best in people. Think about Margaret from Detroit, who spent 37 years married to Robert. Margaret was raised to believe that a good wife always supports her husband, always finds ways to smooth over conflicts, always puts the family's peace above her own needs. When Robert would come home angry, criticizing everything from dinner to how she folded his shirts, Margaret would apologize and try harder. When he belittled her in front of their adult children, she made excuses for his stress at work. What Margaret didn't understand was that her kindness wasn't creating the harmony she desperately wanted. Instead, it was teaching Robert that he could escalate his behavior without consequences. Every time she absorbed his anger, every time she made herself smaller to avoid conflict, she was reinforcing a dynamic where his comfort mattered more than her dignity. This is the trap that ensnares so many good-hearted people. Your instincts as a psychologically healthy person will compel you to give others the benefit of the doubt, to soothe conflicts, to assume the best intentions. These instincts serve you beautifully in most relationships. But in the world of narcissistic manipulation, they become weapons used against you. The narcissist exploits the gap between your assumption of shared values and their calculated approach to relationships. While you think you're building a bridge of understanding, they're mapping out your emotional pressure points, learning exactly what buttons to push to keep you compliant and confused. The cognitive dissonance trap. Why you keep trying. This explains why so many people caught in narcissistic relationships, whether romantic, professional, or familial, experience such intense cognitive dissonance. You keep thinking, if I'm just patient enough, kind enough, loving enough, they'll change. They'll see that I'm different, that I genuinely care. But here's the painful reality. Your kindness is being filed away as weakness in their mental database. It doesn't inspire them to treat you better. It emboldens them to take more. It justifies their behavior in their own mind because, after all, you keep accepting it. Consider the story of William, a 72-year-old retired teacher from Phoenix. His adult son Michael had struggled with various addictions and failures throughout his life, and every time Michael found himself in trouble, he knew exactly how to approach his father. Michael would call with stories of bad luck, unfair treatment by employers, or health problems that prevented him from working. William, remembering the sweet little boy Michael used to be, would send money, make excuses to other family members, and even take out loans to help his son get back on his feet. What William couldn't see was the pattern. Michael wasn't seeking help to change his life. He was seeking resources to continue his lifestyle. The more William gave, the more entitled Michael became. When William occasionally tried to set boundaries, Michael would rage, disappear for months, or threaten self-harm, sending his father into a panic of guilt and renewed accommodation. This illustrates a concept from behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It's when unpredictable rewards strengthen a behavior more than consistent ones. Narcissists are masters of this technique. Often unconsciously, they give just enough kindness, just enough false hope, just enough glimpses of the person you want them to be to keep you emotionally invested. The more you pour your energy, compassion, and resources into the relationship, the more they take. It becomes a cycle where your kindness enables their dysfunction, and they have no motivation to change because the system works perfectly for them. When compassion becomes cowardice. Now, some people might object to this perspective. They might say, but isn't it cruel to be anything but kind? Don't we all deserve grace and understanding? To that, I would respond, kindness without boundaries is not grace. It's self-betrayal. When you continue to be nice to someone who consistently manipulates, exploits, and gaslights you, you're not being moral or virtuous. You're being complicit in your own mistreatment. If your goodness consistently results in you being hurt, diminished, or taken advantage of, then it's not goodness anymore. It's naivety, and worse, it feeds the very dysfunction you're hoping to heal. There's a deeper philosophical question we must face. At what point does compassion become cowardice? When does the refusal to confront someone's destructive behavior stop being noble and start being self-destructive? This is a question that everyone entangled with a narcissistic person must eventually confront. Because continuing to be nice in that context becomes what psychologists call a moral bypass. You're not avoiding conflict for the sake of genuine peace. You're avoiding it because you're afraid of being disliked, afraid of being alone, afraid of being seen as the bad person in the story. The narcissist can sense this fear the way a predator senses vulnerability. They understand, often intuitively, that your niceness is rooted in insecurity rather than genuine strength, and they leverage that understanding to maintain control over the relationship dynamic. Take the example of Dorothy, an 81-year-old widow from Atlanta whose daughter-in-law Patricia had made family gatherings miserable for years. Patricia would make cutting comments about Dorothy's cooking, criticize her decorating choices, and exclude her from important family decisions. When Dorothy would gently try to address these issues, Patricia would become defensive and accuse Dorothy of being too sensitive or trying to cause problems. Dorothy's natural instinct was to apologize, to try harder to please Patricia, to minimize her own hurt feelings for the sake of maintaining access to her grandchildren. But what Dorothy was really doing was teaching Patricia that disrespectful behavior would be tolerated, even rewarded with increased accommodation. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're finding this helpful, because understanding these patterns is the first step toward breaking free from them. Break. The empathy trap. When your greatest strength becomes your vulnerability. Break. Let's examine something even more subtle and insidious. Empathy. This wonderful human capacity to see and feel what another person is experiencing is truly one of our greatest gifts as a species. Without empathy, cooperation would collapse and civilization would crumble into chaos. But empathy, like any virtue, when divorced from wisdom and discernment, becomes a liability that narcissists exploit masterfully. Most people assume that empathy is inherently noble, and in healthy relationships, it absolutely is. But here's what changes everything. Empathy is only noble when it operates within the boundaries of truth and mutual respect. The narcissist doesn't relate to your empathy as something valuable to be treasured. They see it as a tool to be wielded, a weakness to be manipulated as easily as a skilled musician plays an instrument. Narcissists become students of your emotional patterns. Though not in a conscious, reflective way, they instinctively observe your emotional tells, your triggers, the specific words and situations that activate your guilt or your desire to help. They listen for phrases like, I just want peace, or maybe I was too harsh, or I should be more understanding. Every time you hesitate to defend yourself in the name of keeping harmony, they take note. They build a psychological playbook specifically designed around your vulnerabilities. This is what makes narcissistic manipulation so profoundly damaging and confusing. You're not being exploited because you're fundamentally weak or flawed. Quite the opposite. You're being targeted because you care deeply, because your emotional radar is finely tuned, and because you genuinely believe that if you can just understand their pain, if you can help them feel safe or seen, they'll stop hurting you. But that belief is the trap itself. The narcissist isn't seeking healing or understanding. They're seeking control. And your empathy provides the perfect mechanism to achieve it. Consider the case of Harold, a retired accountant from Milwaukee, whose brother Charles had always been the troubled one in the family. Charles would call Harold with elaborate stories about how others had wronged him, how his employers didn't appreciate his talents, how his ex-wives had turned his children against him. Harold, being a naturally compassionate person, would listen for hours, offer advice, sometimes even financial help. What Harold didn't realize was that Charles wasn't looking for solutions or support. He was looking for validation of his victim narrative and someone to absorb his emotional chaos. The more Harold empathized, the more elaborate Charles's stories became. And the more Harold found himself doubting his own perceptions of his brother's behavior. The emotional hijacking process. This is why so many survivors of narcissistic relationships describe feeling emotionally hijacked. They start to doubt their own reality, feel cruel for wanting to set boundaries, and experience guilt for expressing their own hurt or needs. This isn't accidental. It's the predictable result of prolonged empathy manipulation. The narcissist learns to use your very humanity as a tool of control. They present themselves as misunderstood victims, not because they truly are, but because they know this will activate your compassion. Once they've activated that response, they own the emotional framework of the interaction. You're no longer evaluating their behavior critically. You're rationalizing it and justifying what is. In truth, deeply manipulative conduct. Your empathy starts overriding your judgment, and you become an unwilling participant in your own exploitation. This isn't victim blaming. It's an invitation for victims to recognize a crucial truth. You are not morally obligated to understand someone who weaponizes your kindness against you. You do not owe endless patience to someone who interprets your compassion as permission to continue violating your emotional boundaries. When empathy operates without limits, it leads to what psychologists call codependency, keeping you locked in a cycle where your identity becomes tied to managing someone else's emotional chaos. Think about it this way. If you had a friend who consistently borrowed money and never repaid it, would you consider it virtuous to keep lending? Or would you recognize that your continued enabling was actually preventing them from learning responsibility? The same principle applies to emotional boundaries. Wise empathy. The path forward. The alternative isn't to become cold, indifferent, or cruel. That's simply swinging to another harmful extreme. The answer lies in what I call wise empathy, compassion balanced with accountability. Understanding that includes yourself in the equation of care. When you feel yourself being pulled into the narcissist's emotional orbit through pity, guilt, or the desire to help, you need to pause and ask yourself some important questions. Whose needs are being met in this interaction? Is this emotional exchange genuinely reciprocal? Am I being invited into authentic vulnerability? Or am I being played like an instrument for someone else's psychological needs? When you shift from blind empathy to discerning empathy, everything changes. You begin to recognize that some people don't want to be understood in any meaningful way. They want to be obeyed, accommodated, and validated without reciprocity. They want the benefits of your emotional labor without offering anything genuine in return. Once you see this pattern clearly, you can stop trying to fix them and stop expecting them to suddenly recognize your good intentions. You realize they likely do see your perspective and your pain. They just don't care enough to change their behavior because the current arrangement serves their purposes. Let me share with you the story of Eleanor, a 76-year-old grandmother from Charleston. For years, her granddaughter Jessica would visit only when she needed something, whether money, babysitting for her own children, or someone to vent to about her latest crisis. Jessica would arrive in tears, full of dramatic stories about how unfairly life was treating her. And Eleanor's natural grandmother instincts would kick in. Eleanor would listen, comfort, advise, and often write checks to help Jessica through whatever crisis she was facing. But Eleanor began to notice that Jessica never asked about her grandmother's life, never showed interest in Eleanor's health concerns or loneliness, and certainly never offered any support in return. When Eleanor finally began setting gentle boundaries, asking Jessica to visit sometimes just to spend time together without needing something, Jessica became angry and accusatory. She told Eleanor she was becoming selfish in her old age, that family should always help family, and that Eleanor's conditions on her generosity were hurting their relationship. This reaction told Eleanor everything she needed to know. Jessica wasn't interested in a genuine relationship. She was interested in a resource. Once Eleanor understood this, she could empathize with Jessica's struggles without sacrificing her own dignity or financial security. Take a moment to comment below if this resonates with your experience. Sometimes just naming these patterns helps us feel less alone in our confusion. The niceness trap. When being good becomes self-betrayal. Now let's address something that might make you uncomfortable. The concept of being nice. Contrary to what many of us were taught, being nice is not the same as being good. In fact, niceness, when it becomes habitual and unexamined, can be one of the most dangerous traits a person carries into a relationship with someone who has narcissistic tendencies. When you're consistently nice to someone who manipulates and exploits you, you're not demonstrating virtue or moral superiority. You're offering compliance. You're signaling that you're willing to abandon your own values, your own intuition, and often your own dignity to avoid conflict or preserve the illusion of peace. Narcissistic individuals operate within a psychological framework that's deeply hierarchical. In their worldview, relationships consist of dominators and the dominated, those who serve and those who are served. Power is the ultimate game, and control is the prize they're seeking. When you show up to this dynamic with soft boundaries, muted instincts, and a compulsion to keep everyone happy, you're not diffusing the power imbalance, you're confirming it. You're communicating, perhaps unconsciously, that they're in charge and you are not. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. The abuse often doesn't start with obvious cruelty. It typically begins with small requests that seem reasonable, subtle manipulations disguised as emotional needs, or guilt trips presented as expressions of love or concern. Because you're nice, because you don't want to upset them or appear unreasonable. You accommodate these requests again and again. You tolerate the small criticisms. You rationalize the gaslighting by telling yourself they're just stressed or hurting. You suppress your growing resentment and call it patience or maturity. All the while, you believe you're maintaining harmony. But in reality, you're feeding a system that thrives on your silence and self-sacrifice. Consider the story of Frank, a retired postal worker from Denver, whose sister Linda had always been what the family diplomatically called high maintenance. Linda would call Frank multiple times a day, often in crisis about something that required his immediate attention or advice. When Frank was dealing with his own health problems after a heart attack, Linda barely acknowledged his situation because she was consumed with her own drama. Frank's instinct was to be the good brother, to always be available, to never let Linda down. But he began to notice that these calls always left him feeling drained and anxious. Linda never asked how he was doing, never offered support during his recovery, and seemed genuinely irritated when he couldn't drop everything to focus on her needs. When Frank finally tried to set some boundaries, suggesting they limit calls to once a day and that some of her problems might be better addressed with professional help, Linda exploded. She accused him of abandoning her in her time of need, questioned whether he really loved her, and threatened to cut off contact entirely. This reaction revealed something crucial. Linda wasn't seeking support or advice. She was seeking an audience, someone to absorb her emotional chaos and validate her victim narrative. Frank's niceness had created a dynamic where Linda's needs were the only ones that mattered. The fear behind the facade. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Most people who consistently act nice in the face of abuse aren't doing it because they're saints. They're doing it because they're afraid of conflict, afraid of being disliked, afraid of abandonment, afraid of what might happen if they assert themselves. In the context of dealing with narcissistic behavior, this fear becomes the foundation of the entire dysfunctional relationship. It's not really a relationship at all. It's a performance where one person does all the accommodating while the other calls all the shots. Your reluctance to say no, to confront inappropriate behavior, or to challenge unreasonable demands becomes the mechanism that allows the narcissist to dominate and control. But the reason this pattern continues isn't because you're too good or too compassionate. Often, it's because your sense of self-worth has become tied to the approval of others. This is what psychologists call codependency, the need for external validation to regulate your internal emotional stability. You think you're being loving by staying quiet, by absorbing blame, by trying to fix what you didn't break, but what you're really doing is abandoning yourself, bit by bit, in a service of maintaining an illusion of connection. Codependency isn't compassion, it's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. And narcissists are experts at identifying people who will make themselves small, who will carry the emotional weight of the relationship, who will flinch first when conflict arises. They don't admire your niceness or see it as evidence of your good character. To them, your inability to enforce boundaries doesn't signal kindness, it signals utility. You're useful when you're compliant, disposable when you're not. Please share this video with someone who might benefit from this message.